So you have to bear with me.
Yep.
Because I'm from Texas.
That's okay. I'm from Alberta, you know. It's bigger than Texas, just as bad. It's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. Well, I thought about it a lot, you know, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong, because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong, because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry. He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
Are there valid and sound arguments that would lead one to conclude that a God exists? My answer to this so far seems to be no. I thought it would be nice if we started with something quick and easy and simple, like God. In particular, I don't believe there is one, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it.
You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?
I mean just about the subject in general, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on about what I don't think as well, maybe.
Well, it's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a fair bit of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate. And that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of an evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that's a start, I guess.
Except, and so you have to bear with me.
Yep.
Because I'm from Texas.
That's okay. I'm from Alberta, you know. It's bigger than Texas, just as bad.
Yeah. So the curious thing for me is all of that applies seemingly, if I'm understanding it, to religious thought, religious tradition, the value of religious identity to individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not there is a God or whether or not there's sufficient reason to believe there's a God, which is my sticking point. I'm fully fine with the idea, we'll try and get through this without, like, raucous applause, but, you know, hey, at least I got one.
Yeah, you don't never complain about raucous applause.
Because that's the sticking point for me. I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality, that they can be inspired and motivated, educated, and enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But my concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Well, it's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. So I think that distinction can be made, but it's a lot more difficult than people generally think. And I also think that there's no doubt that there are different levels of sophistication of religious belief. You know, what I see happening in this sort of discussion, say frequently, and again, like I said, I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. I see most of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly of the American persuasion, who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory, when it clearly doesn't. Right? I mean, if you're
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
Yeah.
if you're a religious thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory. And that's just self-evident. First of all, like, when was the first scientist? Descartes, Bacon, Newton? Maybe you could chase it back to the Greeks, but no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists, like, I feel for the fundamentalists, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories. And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart, and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now,
Okay.
That doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But,
Well, what I'd like
they're
is to
still
find-
worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. Here's an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished. Well, I thought about it a lot, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong, because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong, because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.
And this is what I point out in the lecture on skepticism, since you didn't get to see the show, is that being wrong feels exactly like being right. Nobody runs around going, oh, I'm wrong, but I'm going to keep believing this. We all assume that we are correct about a great many things. And it's not so much that being wrong is the thing we're afraid of. I think that being exposed as wrong is the thing we're afraid of.
Well, we're also sometimes afraid of being wrong, because if you're wrong at a deep level, it can really hurt you.
Oh, I agree, it
It
can.
can really take you apart. And so people don't like to be taken apart. Like if you're wrong about your wife, for example, that tends to be a very painful thing. And that's something that's worth pursuing to try to figure out why that is.
That's why I hide the frying pan.
That should make you popular. Okay, so one of the issues that I have, and you can respond to this, is that let's say the celebrity atheist types, because I actually like that phrase, they don't seem to me to be contending with the real issues. They seem
What
to
are
be
the
going
real
at
issues?
Dostoevsky, he's a real issue. Tolstoy, he's a real issue. Carl Jung, 20 books and maybe 15 seminars, he's a real issue. Mircea Eliade. Like, there are some serious heavy hitters in the religious phenomenology domain. And my sense so far, I just finished reading all of Harris's books, for example, is he doesn't contend with them at all. And it's like, for me, that's like being an evolutionary biologist and not being aware of Darwin. It's actually a big problem. It's not something you can hand wave away. Jung was a mystic. It's like, sorry. He was about as smart as Friedrich Nietzsche.
I think this gets to basically the same point I was talking about before. The thing that you're objecting to, it seems, is that many of us don't want to address the aspects of religion that you find value in, because we're only focused on, perhaps as I'm talking in the show, from a scientific skepticism perspective of, are there valid and sound arguments that would lead one to conclude that a God exists? My answer to this so far seems to be no. And the apologists, the theologians, they keep presenting the arguments, the teleological arguments, moral arguments, and all these things. They have nothing to do with the phenomenology of religion. They have nothing to do with how this impacts people's lives. This is a question of, is it in fact the case? Is it consistent with reality that there is a God, and is it consistent with reality that there is good reason to believe there's a God? That is where the focus is primarily.